Okay, so we're live. We're going to be chatting about meta-ethics. I'm a moral non-naturalist. James Fodor is a moral naturalist, and I think quite a potent defender of moral naturalism. So do you want to just sort of start by laying out your, like, just the sort of brief overview of your views about morality?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, my views about morality are are evolving and subject to change. So, I'm a moral realist. So, I think that there are objective moral facts. And as Matthew just said, I'm also a naturalist. So, but by that I mean I think that moral facts are facts about the natural world or like the physical world. And so they're not substantively different in kind to other types of facts that we access through, well, just I guess sciences or everyday interaction with the environment. They're obviously a separate domain, right? But I don't think there's some sort of ontological gap or divide there that some people think that there is. Um, and so specifically, I think that moral facts are something like facts about the well-being of sentient beings. Um, and I also think that we have reasons to act in accordance with these facts, or that is to act in a way that promotes the well-being of sentient creatures. We could maybe, I assume we'll get into talking about the nature of these sorts of reasons later. So I lean to some form of um, reasons externalism with respect to normative reasons. Um, and was there anything else I was going to add to that? Um, Oh yeah, so maybe one more thing I'll say is that I find, for people who are interested, Peter Railton to be fairly influential in my thinking, although I don't agree with everything that he says. But his account about sort of grounding morality in terms of idealized preferences, I find quite convincing. So there's a few basic starting points.
Yeah, so I'll just sort of lay out my basic view. So I agree in terms of the maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures. I think that those are the things that we have reason to do, and I agree that morality is grounded in what we have the impartial reason to do. So if we were fully rational and impartial, what are the things that we would care about? I'm a non-naturalist about morality, so I think that reasons are not any type of natural property. Um, I don't think that, for example, they're open to, like, I don't think that there's any test that one could perform, even in theory, to figure out the things that we have reasons to do. Albeit there are things that I think could provide us some evidence for things that we have reason to do. Um, so I guess we can start by just so one objection that the sort of classic objection to naturalistic accounts is the open question argument, where if you just say that moral facts are just facts about what would increase the well-being of conscious creatures, then the statement moral facts, then the statement, like, one ought to do things that would increase the well-being of conscious creatures, would just be trivial. It would just be like saying a bachelor is an unmarried man. But it seems like when you're advancing claims about what would along the lines of we ought to do what would maximize the well-being of conscious creatures, you're making some substantive claim. So how would you respond to the open question objection?
Yeah, I don't know that that's an issue just for ethical naturalists. I think that that is potentially an issue for any realist account, at least that attempts to give a grounding for moral facts. But I personally don't find it that convincing. I think that it's probably only an issue if I think it's only an objection to attempts to provide an analytical equivalence between two statements. So if I were to say that uh, maximizing the well-being of sentient creatures is sort of analytically equivalent or definitionally identical to a statement about what is right or wrong to do. So, for example, if I were to say that it is good to, or it is right to not torture babies for fun, then that's just equivalent to it is right to, not torturing babies for fun promotes the well-being of sentient creatures. Then yeah, that's obviously not sort of informative, right? That's and it seems to have incorrect properties such as that it seems that we can ask, well, is it right to promote the well-being of sentient creatures? And it seems that if we have certain sentences like it is right to promote the well-being of sentient creatures, then that is informative in a way that it is right to do what's right isn't informative, which is a problem if we think that those are sort of equivalent. But I don't take this analysis to be one of sort of semantic equivalence or definitional stipulation, or one of analytic or an analytic truth. I think that it's basically a empirical truth that we determine by investigation. So I just don't think it's that sort of claim. So it is, I think, informative to say that this is what morality is, because we start out by having a sort of pre-theoretically perhaps a bundle of intuitions or not entirely consistent views about morality, and then we do our analysis, or ideally we do our analysis, and then we come to a more well-formed and consistent set of views. And so I think that is informative in a way that if you just say, a bachelor is an unmarried man, then that plausibly isn't informative, because that's already contained in the definition of bachelor. But I don't think that, the idea that, say, doing good is just promoting the well-being of sentient creatures is contained in the definition of doing good in the same way. So I guess I just don't see it as an analytic truth.
Yeah, so I think that response is a good one, and I think that on naturalistic accounts, it's reasonable to hold that goodness it does not have the same semantic meaning as being the types of things that maximize the well-being of conscious creatures. And there are a lot of other statements where you say that are equivalent to saying A is A in some sense. So like water is H2O. But that statement is informative. But roughly what that statement means is this substance that we refer to as water, this thing that we drink that falls out of the sky during rain, etc. This is the same thing as the substance that you get when you have 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen molecules. But so I get if in order to say like maximizing well-being is good or is what one ought to do, it seems like the phrase "what one ought to do" would have to be describing some other naturalistic property, which you just argue just sort of a property of it is that it coincides with, is that it's the same as the maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures. So do you think that it is sort of a separate property that just has the function of being the same as maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures, or do you think that
well, that's not how I would describe it, right? So I don't think it's right to say that water has, that H2O has some sort of separate property in virtue of which it is water. It turns, I think that's actually a useful comparison there. What I think of as the naturalist doing here has been described as an informative identification, right? So the notion of water doesn't, maybe it does now, but at least historically it didn't include as part of its meaning the idea that it's H2O, right? We discovered that through investigation. Likewise, I don't think the notion, let's say the pre-theoretic notion of let's say goodness, includes the a worked out theory of that it's promoting the well-being of sentient creatures. Maybe there's elements of that in there, right? But I don't think it's just all contained in the definition. We I think have to discover that through philosophical reflection and some component of scientific investigation as well. I don't see those as sort of as entirely distinct. I see it as sort of continuum. So that's why I mentioned both. But yeah, so I don't think there's some sort of separate property of water in virtue of which it's H2O or vice versa. I think that we just sort of find out that that's what water is. Likewise, I think that there's no separate property of, I don't know, sentient beings or their experiences in virtue of which it's good or right to promote that. I think that we do our investigation and work out that that's actually what goodness is about. That's what it refers to. Or that's the best account of it, essentially.
Sure. So I was perhaps slightly unclear with the water analogy. I wasn't intending to claim that there's some separate that H2O is some separate property from water, and we discover that they coincide. I was saying that, so like for something that is semantically identical to water, so like, you know, a watery substance that falls out of the sky and people drink when they're thirsty, etc. Saying water is that thing is not informative, because that's just sort of what water is by definition. And, you know, now maybe we include water being H2O as part of the definition, but prior to it being included as the definition, it was a discovery in the sense that we figured out that these two naturalistic properties that we thought were distinct actually were the same thing. But so what naturalistic property would morality be, where it's this distinct thing that we discover is the same thing as maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures? Like, it seems like an account like the one Railton gives is that what we would do if we were sort of reflected a lot and were impartial is the same thing as what would maximize the well-being of conscious creatures. Would you agree with that account, or?
Well, I mean, that's not the substance. Well, let me rephrase that. The element of Railton that I find interesting is his use of his reduction of what is morally good to what promotes non-moral goodness, treating everyone equally, right, or all interests equally, or something. And then he reduces non-moral goodness in terms of a person or beings idealized. What their idealized self would want themselves to want. So in terms of idealized preferences, essentially, that's the part that I find of relevance. Now, I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to in terms of, I don't recall as part of his account that there's a sort of a twofold reduction of morality to reflection in the reflection that you mentioned, and then goodness properties to idealized preferences or something. To me, I don't know, maybe this is a different way of thinking about it, but I just think of it in terms of we investigate what is the reference of moral discourse and our moral concepts. And I think that the best candidate for that is something like, the well-being of sentient creatures. I don't know that there's a lot. I mean, you can unpack exactly how that works, but I don't know that there's much more to say. So we start with this practice of moral discourse and a sort of a set of pre-theoretic ideas about it. And then we begin our investigation as to what aspect of the world could this refer to. And maybe it doesn't refer to anything, right? Maybe it's all confused. So I guess if you want a naturalistic reference as to what morality is pre-theoretically, it's just our moral discourse and practice and thoughts about it, right? I don't know that there's something else outside that we then identify with. I mean, isn't that the same in the case of water, right? Like, we don't know what substance water is. We have a concept of water. I mean, like, it's that stuff that falls from the sky. And then we work out that actually the substance that this is made of is H2O. I think that's broadly the same thing as how it works with morality.
I think, okay, that seems like a good response to the open question argument. So in terms of the account where morality is about what our idealized selves would want us to want. So one objection that I would have to that would be the Parfit's normativity objection, where, like, it seems like we can imagine lots of agents that we would just stipulate in them a desire that wouldn't go away upon careful reflection, that would occur when they became idealized, that where it would seem like they would still desire things that would not truly be in their best interests. So, like, take, for example, an agent, like, let's imagine that we programmed an AI to be sentient. And then we programmed the AI to have a higher order desire. We just put this in the code for it to have a higher order desire, for it to be as miserable as possible as much of the time as possible. It's not like, to the extent that that's just a desire that we sort of put in manually. It seems like that wouldn't go away if it became its idealized self. But it nonetheless seems like it would be bad for the AI to be in horrendous agony, even if it had a higher order desire to be in horrendous agony.
Yeah, so I don't have much of a clear idea about what an idealized version of an AI that was programmed in this way would want, right? Or what preferences it would have. And I think that that's one of the weaknesses of Railton's account, is that we don't necessarily have access to what our idealized selves would want, right? It's a way of thinking about incorporating aspects that are outside of our knowledge or experience about things that we sort of would want if only we knew about it or could think about it clearly enough. So I see that as a helpful way of modeling that aspect of morality, that it's not just about what you happen to want now. It's about what you would want if you sort of were able to have all the relevant information and think through it carefully enough. Now, how that works for an AI that's been programmed in this rather odd way, I honestly have no idea. I'm not, the idea that you can just put in a higher order desire for it to be miserable or something. I mean, I suppose that there are people who seem to like being miserable, but I would tend to say that those people would not have that desire if they their idealized selves would not have that desire. Partly that's because when we talk about at least when I talk about an idealized self, I'm imagining that the person has, I mean, I think that the account Railton gives is something like that they have access to all, I can't remember if he says all facts or all non-moral facts, and they are like fully instrumentally rational or something along those lines. But in that includes having knowledge of, I guess, other modes of experience and ways of living, right? So if you knew other ways of existing and how you would feel and things like that, and you would still choose to be miserable, or your idealized self would still want yourself to be miserable, that just seems rather odd. And I think that maybe that is where the intuition that you have would come in, that, well, it wouldn't be rational for the agent to choose that. And I would say, yeah, I agree. But that should be picked up by this idea that, well, the idealized version of themselves would have access to all these other modes of being and would recognize the reasons to prefer one over the other. Now, would that apply in the case of this hypothetical AI, which has this very, I don't know, strange preference structure? Honestly, don't know. And also, honestly, I'm not very worried about that as an objection. I'm not. I mean, some people, I don't know whether this will be a difference between us, right? Some philosophers think that we should be trying to find theories, morally or otherwise, that are true in like every possible world, or I don't know, a very wide range of possible worlds. I don't find that a very interesting project. I'm interested in a morality that applies for this world, and particularly for humans, I guess, and animals, I guess, sentient aliens, and would have to sort of worry about that as they come. But in terms of like, are there hypothetical AI systems that maybe could be constructed for which this model perhaps wouldn't work? Well, maybe. I don't know. I just don't find that a very important objection to me, because morality, maybe it wouldn't even apply to such a being with such an odd preference structure. That may not be a very, you might not find that very satisfactory, but I guess I just don't see the relevance of something like that.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that our accounts are somewhat, so they're somewhat similar in that we both agree that morality would be about what we would do if what our sort of idealized selves would care about, and so like just morality broadly is about just what an impartial idealized agent would do. But well, you think that they're true in virtue of being the types of things that would be cared about by an impartial idealized agent. I think that they would be cared about by an impartial idealized agent in virtue of the fact that in virtue of moral fact characteristics of the situation. So, like much the same way that we might say that one would be epistemically rational if they hold beliefs that a sort of idealized epistemic agent would hold. They wouldn't be rational holding those beliefs because the souped up version of that epistemic agent would hold those beliefs. Rather, they would be rational for holding the beliefs for the same reason that the souped up version of the agent would be rational for holding the beliefs. Namely, there are particular facts in the world that provide them with reasons, with epistemic reasons, and I think that would similarly provide us with moral reasons. But to the extent that the account, to the extent that the account is just sort of about things are just good in virtue of them being things that our idealized selves would care about. It sort of raises the question of like, why would our idealized selves care about one thing over another? Because on my account, there are reasons to care about particular things. There are reasons to prefer well-being over suffering, and so the sort of the characteristics of that experience make it so that our idealized selves would not care about them. But it seems like on your account or on Railton's account, there's no deeper account of why our idealized selves would have those particular sets of preferences.
Right. Yeah. So I think that this is a difference here in terms of what's taken as primitive. So I might advance a few points here. So one is that, yes, so I take what Railton's trying to do, or at least as the parts of it that are of interest to me, is to give an account of moral goodness. I don't necessarily think that it gives an account, and I believe that this is what Railton thinks as well, about moral reasons that I would defend somewhat separately. But in terms of moral goodness, yeah, so I think that the idea here is that it's a preference-focused account that says what's good for a person is sort of what they want, but not just what they want now, right? Because we can be mistaken about what will be like what will satisfy preferences, or even we can have higher order preferences that we haven't sort of thought about, etc. So that's why there's a need to idealize. Now, in terms of, you ask the question, well, in virtue of what do our idealized selves want by anything over something else? I don't think that it's, what I would say is that I don't know that Railton's account requires there to be any such additional reasons. I think it's taking those facts about what our idealized selves would want as the basis, as what goodness is being reduced to, but then considered impartially across people. But I don't think that it rules out the idea that there could be further reasons, right? It's just that I don't know that it has to take a view on a position on that. So I would say that perhaps for some things there are further reasons in virtue of which our idealized selves want something. I think that that's going to depend on that's going to depend on your account of reasons and a whole bunch of other viewpoints that we take, right? But so I don't think that this sort of idealized preferences account in any way contradicts with the idea that there could be further reasons. It's just that it doesn't, I don't know that it needs to appeal to those. So there might be some things that our idealized selves would prefer that our idealized selves do have a reason for. There might be some things that our idealized selves don't have any reason. That's just sort of a brute preference or something. I think the account's consistent with both of those types of preferences. And that seems kind of right to me, right? Because there are some things that may just be brute preferences. And I think that those should sort of count as well in terms of what's good for us.
Well, so I think that brute preferences should count as what's good for us to the extent that those brute preferences, produce desirable mental states. But if one had a brute preference, we could imagine an alien world where, this was the example that Parfit gave was a person with future Tuesday indifference. And so we could imagine,
yeah, right.
And so a person is indifferent to their suffering if it occurs on future Tuesdays. So they'd rather experience just like the worst possible misery on Tuesday rather than a pinprick on Monday. And so this person, we could stipulate that they have these preferences as a result of evolution. So they just, these are just very deeply ingrained preferences. And their brute preferences, and yet it still seems like if they endured horrendous agony on Tuesday rather than a pinprick on Monday, still seems like they would be making an error of some sort. And
well, the question is, would their idealized selves prefer that or not?
Well, but on your account, what our idealized selves would prefer, it seemed to be just sort of like brute facts about what our idealized selves. About just the preferences that our idealized selves would have. And so I don't know how you can confidently proclaim that that our idealized selves would necessarily not have this future Tuesday indifferent.
Well, as I said, I don't know that the theory is committed to the idea that idealized preferences are brute facts. As I said, I think some of them may be, and for others, an account could be given. I think that that's plausible that an account could be given. In fact, most idealized preferences won't be brute facts, it seems, because this is an issue about how you think preference structure works. Like, are there just fundamental preferences that can't change, or how does it work? But presumably there's some sort of hierarchy to it. Like, many of our preferences probably exist in virtue of other things. Like, I want this because I want that because I want that, right? And so if you think that that's true of an idealized self, plausibly it is, right? That a lot of preferences are kind of derived from more fundamental ones. Then the more derived preferences aren't going to be brute, right? They're going to exist in virtue of the more fundamental ones. But the question is, if there are fundamental preferences, or however many there might be of them, are those brute? And I would say, well, I don't know. Maybe some of them are. Maybe, and a further account could be given. And to work that out, I think what we need to do is explore what we think about motivational structure and rationality and things like this. I'm kind of open to the idea that there could be reasons for some of these preferences. I don't necessarily have a strong view about that. But what I would say is that I'm not going to say that I would assume that there cannot be an idealized agent that doesn't have this preference about what is it, Tuesday indifference, or next Tuesday indifference, or whatever the phrase is. Future Tuesday, that's the one. Yes, future Tuesday. So can I rule that out just sort of carte blanche? Well, no, I don't think I can. I guess the question would be, do we have good reasons for thinking that there are people like that? And I'm not sure that we do. So once again, I'm not sure why that is an objection. Let me just rephrase this. A lot of objections to this sort of idealized preferences account seem to be based around the idea that if we can construct hypothetical agents that would have preference structures that idealized preference structures that are bizarre or seem wrong, then that's an objection to the theory. I'm just not sure why that's an objection to the theory.
Well, so it's an objection to the theory because it seems like plausible moral principles should have plausible implications regarding merely imagined cases. So, if there was a moral principle that proclaimed that if the sky were purple, it would be okay to torture infants, even though the sky is not in fact purple, and that would have no significant ramifications the way that the world actually is, it seems like we would still have decisive reason to reject views of that sort. Just based on the principle that it should have plausible principles, even in hypothetical cases.
Yeah, but I agree with that, but it does depend on the hypotheticals, right? So the fact that the sky is not purple is not what bothers me here. The issue here is that I think that we have good reasons for, very good reasons actually, for our belief that the color of the sky is not relevant to, let's say, our reasons for torturing or not torturing people, right? Now, but in the case of the hypotheticals that we've been talking about, so the first one was this AI with a desire to, or higher order desire to suffer, and the second one was the future Tuesday indifference guy. It's not clear what reasons that we have such similar reasons for any particular belief about whether this is sort of what the sort of correct answer is. So I guess it seems to me that there's an appeal to intuition that, well, you just sort of can't have a difference in attitude between Tuesdays and Mondays with respect to not just a person, like an actual human, but like any hypothetical agent couldn't have that as a rational distinction, as a rational preference. And I'm just not sure what reasons we have for thinking that. And that's why I say I'm not sure why it's an objection to the theory. It would just seem to say that it seems that the objection amounts to some people have the intuition that this just cannot be true in any theory. And I'm not sure that I agree with that. I'm not sure what the basis for that is. I don't think that's analogous to like color of the sky torturing children, because I think we can give fairly clear reasons as to why those two just aren't connected. So I think it comes down to explicating why these particular examples are relevant. Otherwise, then someone like me is just going to say, well, that's what follows from the theory, that if there were such hypothetical agents, then that would be in there, that would be what's not non-morally good for them. I would just say that I'm not too worried about that because I don't think there are such agents, but it's not clear that has an application for anyone else.
I think that to the extent that we found that principle to be sufficiently counterintuitive that it served as a decisive counterexample, then that would give us reason to reject the theory. But it seems like you're saying that you don't think that.
So this is exactly where I differ, right? Because I think that that's a wrong approach. Unless we consider the objection to be essentially a disproof, like in mathematics or something like that. And this is maybe more of a meta-philosophical point, right? I don't think I think that's an unhelpful approach to philosophy, and I acknowledge here that this might put me in the minority in terms of analytic philosophy. I'm not entirely sure, right? But I see philosophy as continuous with the sciences, and that's not how science works, right? What I mean, despite an idea of like naive falsificationism, where if we find one observation that's inconsistent with the theory, we falsify the theory. That's actually not how it works, because if that were the case, essentially all scientific theories would be falsified, because there are always counter observations and anomalies and puzzles that they can't account for. And in that case, what we do is we continue to develop the theory, and we seek more observations, and we tinker it and so forth. So I think that if there are puzzles like this, then that doesn't falsify the theory. At most, it causes us to ask, well, maybe the theory requires some tweaks, or we need to think about these puzzles. I don't personally find them as very convincing counterexamples, as I've said, because I'm not sure what the principle that's being appealed to is, in virtue of which we should say that the idealized preference accounts got them wrong. But even if we don't go that far and we just say, well, they're sort of unresolved issues, I will say, yeah, that maybe they're unresolved issues and we need to think more about it. I don't think, but to say that refutes the theory, I think is going a lot too far. I think what we need to do is look at what the best account is that we have available and how plausible it is. And insofar as we think that that's the best account, then we sort of say, well, I sort of lean towards that. Or at least that's how I sort of think about these sorts of things.
Yeah, so I would agree that, so like if there was just sort of a one-off hypothetical that sort of didn't jive with our intuitions, but that we thought that there were lots of other, independent plausible reasons to think that the theory is correct, then overall the balance of considerations would favor the theory. But there seem to be quite a lot of these scenarios, and there are also, I think, other objections to ethical naturalism.
Well, we can talk about those, right? But maybe just focus on these for the moment. These sort of counterexamples.
Yeah. So one of them is the future Tuesday indifference one, and to sort of add a little bit to the scenario, we can even stipulate that at the end of the either Monday, right after Tuesday, the person will die, and when the person is being brutally tortured on Tuesday, they'll be hypnotized to believe that it is Monday. So their subjective experience is just identical to if they were being brutally tortured on Monday. But in fact, it's a Tuesday. But they just sort of attach metaphysical significance to the day of the week being Tuesday rather than Monday, even though it doesn't affect their experiences. And so in that case, I have a pretty strong intuition that no rational being could have that future Tuesday indifferent preference in the hypnosis case.
Well, if that's true, then what's the problem?
Well, so I would agree with you that morality is. So I would agree with you that morality is about what our idealized preferences would be. But I think that there is a deeper explanation of why particular things would be our idealized preferences, namely that there are particular things that we have reasons to care about. And so,
but that's, as I've been saying, I don't think that's inconsistent with the account that I've been defending. I think it's open as to whether there are further reasons or not.
Well, I mean, I'd be curious as to how, like, on a naturalistic account, you would give an account of there being sort of irreducible.
Well, obviously, I wouldn't say that they're irreducible, right? But I'm just, it's open as to in virtue of what we think these idealized preferences pertain, and whether some of them are brute or whether some of them can be reduced to others, or exactly what the structure is. So I think that, I just don't know that the theory is determinate about that. So what I would say is I find it very hard myself to imagine that there could be an idealized agent that had the preferences that you describe. And as such, I don't worry about it so much, because I just don't think there are any such beings. But you say, well, but your theory would say that if there was such a being, then that would be what's non-morally good for them. And I would say, yes, that's what the theory would say. But because I don't think that there are any such beings, I don't know that that's a problem. Like, it seems like it's kind of a null case. Like, I don't know. Maybe this is, again, so if there is a counterexample that seems unreasonable, and if there are more and more of them, then that does count against a theory, right? But to me, it does depend on the significance of the counterexample. If you take a theory outside of its domain of application and it gives nonsense, then I don't see that as a significant problem with the theory. I see the theory as attempting to give an account for morality, right? And I don't know that morality, and by that I mean moral practice and discourse, has anything to say about agents that probably can't even exist with this bizarre preference structure. So the fact that the theory might give us strange counterintuitive results, I'm just not sure why that should be an issue.
I mean, it doesn't seem like there would be. So if your account, if you think that there's some deeper account of reasons where it's not just reducible to brute facts about what our particular preferences are, then I think maybe that other account could provide a grounding for it. I'd be curious to hear sort of the details of how we can sort of give an account of reasons where it's not where it's not just sort of brute facts about what the preferences of our idealized selves would be. But it doesn't seem like there's anything like incoherent about this scenario. The scenario just seems to be like, like lots of people have particular mental.
I don't think it's logically impossible, if that's what you mean by incoherent. But I just think that there probably aren't any such beings. I mean, I guess we're talking about idealized beings. So then we're talking about counterfactuals, right? I guess I'm failing to feel concerned about. Oh, well, let me rephrase it. Let me phrase this in a different way. So it seems that you would say that your account would provide a reason for, or an explanation, let's say, as to why certain preference structures are impossible for idealized agents. That is that perfectly instrumentally rational and they have access to all the relevant facts, right? So you would give an explanation for, well, this is why we wouldn't see any such things. Whereas my account doesn't, at least at present, have any explanation for that. And as I've said, I'm not really trying to explain that. I'm sort of taking that as given and then trying to link that to morality. And that seems a good argument if one can give an explanation for why these future Tuesday indifference and other things wouldn't actually be possible, then that would be a good reason to accept that account, I think. But I don't know that the failure I don't think it's a failure, because I just don't think that that's something that I've attempted to do or that Railton's trying to do. I think what they're trying to do is give a grounding of moral goodness in terms of idealized preferences. And I think that that's an important project. In terms of trying to explain why certain types of idealized preferences may not be possible because in virtue of, there's reasons for why, idealized agents wouldn't have certain preference structure. That could also be useful, but it seems like it's not really the same question. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense to reject one account on the basis that it doesn't answer a different question.
Well, right. I mean, and this would be less of a disagree. I'm in sort of largely in agreement with Railton's account that morality is about what our idealized selves would want. But I think that the distinction is, I think that our idealized selves would want things because they're good, and Railton's account seems to think that things are good because our idealized selves would want them. That's
not really an agreement. Then that's putting the reduction in the opposite direction. I mean, the idea of Railton's account, again, as I understand it, so insofar as I'm appealing it, is that it's attempting to give an account of moral goodness by reducing it to what's non-morally good across, treating agents equally, or at least people. I don't know that he talks about other agents. And then non-moral goodness for a given agent is further reduced to what their idealized selves would want their actual selves to want. So this allows us to understand, or it provides an explanation for basically why certain natural states of affairs have a goodness property and why others don't, right? It allows us to understand it in terms of ultimately idealized preferences. Now, to me, that is informative and helpful and does give a good account for unifying a bunch of aspects of morality. As I've said, I'm open to there being further explication of, in virtue of what certain things are idealized preferences. But what I think would be inconsistent is then to sort of flip that around and draw the reduction sort of back the other way. But I think that there could be, there could be a further account to be given as to, I mean, maybe there are more fundamental things that are good even than idealized preferences, which maybe you'd say, well, then we don't need idealized preferences. We could just reduce straight to that. I'm not sure. Again, I guess coming back to what I said at the start, I'm not finally committed to this account. This is an account that I find persuasive and I think has positive aspects to it. But more generally, as a naturalist, I would be open to alternative naturalistic reductions that maybe do a better job than Railton. So I guess I mean, maybe at this point, I'd be interested in hearing more. I know you're not a naturalist, right? But about what you think about how about in virtue of what certain states of affairs are good, because I don't. It's sort of hard for me to compare accounts when I don't really understand how you think about it.
Well, so my account is sort of similar to Parfit's. I think that there's irreducible normativity. Now, that may sound like a little bit of a cop out, that the thing that gives us reason is that the sort of just facts which provide us reasons. But I mean, I take reason to be sort of a primitive concept, and I think that there are things about the world that provide us with reasons, and I think that the reason to prefer that account is to the account that you've given is largely was in part because of cases like the one that I've spelled out about, like Future Tuesday and different.
So would you? So what do you see as the relationship between goodness and normativity or reason? So do you think that we have reason to do things because they're good, or are things good because we have reason to do them, or maybe something else?
I think that things that things are good because we have reason to do them.
Yeah, okay. That's what it sounded like from what you were saying. I think on Railton, I don't think has a clear account of normativity. In fact, I don't think he's an ethical, I don't think he's a moral rationalist. So I don't think that he necessarily thinks that something being right to do something entails you have a reason to do it. No, I differ on that, but I would give a separate account of normativity. But I just want to understand your account a little better. So you're going to reduce, so something's good in virtue of the fact that we have a reason to do it, or perhaps our idealized selves would have a reason. Maybe you want to idealize it, but I'm not exactly sure. But and so then you say, well, in virtue of what do we have a reason to do something? And that's just a primitive. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or at least some of the reasons are primitive. I guess you're going to say some of them derive from others, right? But there's some that are primitive. So, but I'm quite uncomfortable with primitives. But maybe we can put that to the side for the moment and just understand what the structure of the account is. So, to saying this primitive would just mean that there's sort of nothing in virtue of which it pertains. It just sort of is. But there's still a question as to what sorts of reasons we have, even if they're primitive. Like, well, what are they, and how do we know what they are? So that's an epistemic question.
Well, I think that in terms of the things that we have, like sort of moral reasons to do. I think moral and epistemic reasons are different. That I think that what we have moral reasons to do, do things which increase the well-being of conscious creatures. We like our normative counts are identical. I think maybe slightly different, but
yeah. And so, but I'm just trying to understand the structure of your account, right? I'm not trying to argue about it at this point. I just want to understand. So you would agree with that, right? But you would say that if I ask why do we have that reason, you would just say, well, there's no further fact of the matter about why we have that reason or why that reason exists. Is that correct?
Well,
yeah, we don't have that reason in virtue of anything more fundamental.
Right. Yeah. The reasons are irreducible.
Okay. But so then the other question is, how do we sort of know that that's what we have reasons to, or what's the account as to how we have epistemic access to that?
Well, so I think that we can sort of carefully reflect, sort of a similar way to the way that we would figure out what we have epistemic reason to believe. So we can sort of reflect carefully about a variety of cases, sort of see if there are, like, lots of people think that we have reasons to, like, care about rights, for example. So we see if those accounts are coherent, if they seem reducible to more fundamental things, etc. Just the sort of common project of moral philosophy would just be the way that we figure out what we have reason to do.
Yeah, I guess maybe this comes into the objection part of it. So one of the reasons I'm a naturalist is because I think that helps us to understand our connection to these sort of facts, that these facts are ultimately facts about the natural world, or at least sort of counterfactual states with respect to the natural world, right? And we can access that by empirical observation, interacting with Lord, and theorizing about it. So I see that the process of moral philosophy as actually continuous or contiguous with that of the natural sciences. I'm not asking you to agree with that. I'm just sort of fleshing this out at this point, right? So, so I think that there is a point of epistemic access for us about these facts. That doesn't make it easy or straightforward. And I think that it's often the idea of straw man is that, oh, well, you can't find morality in a test tube. Or you can't actually find much in a test tube. That's not, I'm not saying you've said that, but I've heard people say this, right, who I think should know better. I've read philosophers who say things like this, and I think that this is silly. If we think about how science arrives at understanding of the world, I think that that's broadly how, say, I as an ethical naturalist arrive at my understanding of the moral structure of the world, with some domain-specific aspects to it. But I would say that the epistemic structure is comparable. Now, what coming to the critique side of it, what I don't quite understand is how a non-naturalist, and this applies to morality as well as other things such as people believe in universals or Platonic forms or other things like that, right? Platonism and others. I don't understand the argument as to how as to what the point of epistemic access is to these sorts of facts. So I understand the idea that we can reflect on these things, but I guess the idea would be if reasons are this sort of just ontological primitive, it's not clear that any reflection would connect us to them at all. Why we have sort of any ability to access them at all. Now, at least to me, I would say that on the naturalist side, the two sort of pillars here are moral discourse and practice, which is kind of where we get our pre-theoretic concepts from, and the actual well-being of sentient creatures, which is to some extent empirical, right? And building on those empirical bases, we construct an account of morality. I can, and I'm not saying that. So the non-naturalist could use those as well. It's just that at the end of the day, you could end up with an account that plausibly has nothing to do with the reasons that we have, because I don't know how these reasons interact with any of those things. Does that kind of make sense? Maybe I'm not getting at the core of it because I don't fully understand your account. But if reasons are this sort of primitive, what's the reason for thinking that they in any way sort of show themselves through our moral practice or observations about the world or anything really?
Yeah, so I think that a good analogy here would be for epistemic reasons. I think that epistemic reasons are very similar. So with epistemic reasons, I think that that the reasons that we have are provided by facts about the world. So our reason to believe that, and for one theory of quantum physics is provided by certain facts about the world. But if you ask okay, this theory makes correct predictions and such, and best explains the data, but at some point the chain of justification is going to bottom out, and so you're going to say okay, I get that we have that this theory makes all these correct predictions and seems to be a good explanation of data, but why does this give us a reason to believe it? And it just seems like there's no deeper account. I think that a similar thing would be true of morality. And so much the same way that in the case of epistemic reasons, we can sort of carefully reflect and see what things greater reflection seems to incline us to care about. We can make arguments for one side or the other, much like we can do that for what we should believe. We can do similar things for figuring out the things that we should care about.
So that's very interesting, right? So I think I would agree with most of that, except when you said that, when we do our analysis and think carefully about things, let's say we find a theory that's very well empirically supported and accounts for a lot of data, and you ask, yeah, I get that, but does in virtue of what is it well supported, or should we believe it, or whatever? And at some point, you're going to bottom out in something. I mean, there's a couple of points of disagreement there. I don't think knowledge bottoms out in that way. I lean more towards coherentism, but I don't know that that's the crux of the objection here, because what I would say is that at that point, I want to link it to what I talk about as I've been talking about as moral practice and discourse. In this case, it would be epistemic practice and discourse. So I want to say, look, at some point, we want an account of word meaning and usage. And here I don't mean purely in terms of, so I don't think of this as an analytic account, just thinking about the meaning, but I think about it more broadly in terms of also patterns of usage, right? And this may not all be already contained in the concept, as in we may use the word in inconsistent ways. And so part of an account of like a philosophical account, as distinct from a purely semantic account, would be to explain what things in the world the theory is referring to, if any, and help us think more consistently about it, and also link it to other things that we believe, right? So I don't think, I've got to be careful here. I don't think philosophical accounts are purely semantic accounts, as in that they're just drawing out things that are already in the definition of words. But I do think that they need to be linked back, and they are linked back to our pre-theoretic notions and understandings of word meaning, right? Because if I'm to say something like, well, what is knowledge, or what is goodness? And how could you possibly, it seems to me, how could one possibly answer that question unless we start something, unless we have some, unless we have some input from our concept about what these things are. So we are drawing on our understanding of word meaning to some extent when we are engaged in this process, right? So essentially what I want to say is that then facts about, say, epistemic normativity or morality or whatever else are going to trace back to facts about our usage of concepts and discourse and practice surrounding these. So in that sense, and maybe this is a difference in labeling, I don't know, but that's the sense in which I think that that's, first of all, empirical, and second of all, not irreducible, because we can say that it's not just an irreducible fact of the matter about what we have reasons to do. That reduces to this whole notion of reasons and how we, and the sort of social embeddedness of reasons talk and reasons practice. If we didn't have that word, then it seems that the whole thing wouldn't even make any sense, right? So I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but I do see that as empirically grounded in, I guess, what you might broadly call semantic, socio-cultural practice of a concept. It's not just sort of free floating and primitive. I think that that's wrong.
Well, yeah. So I would agree that, we can employ conceptual analysis to sort of figure out what we mean when we're talking about goodness. And I think that the best account is, when we're talking about, goodness in a moral sense, it's about what we have. It's about the things that we have impartial reason to care about. Sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. I think that, like it, I think that I'm not just interested in providing a semantic account of how goodness is used. And so, if there was an account that was given that was able to explain how we were using goodness, that was able to reduce it to some natural property that had nothing to do with reasons, and then that we were able to sort of settle the disputes about relating to that natural property, and it turned out that the deontology was correct or something, to the extent that didn't have anything to do with reasons. I wouldn't really care about that concept. It seems like
well, that's interesting. So what facts are you appealing to, or what reasons or evidences or just sort of anything could you be appealing to beyond what you've just said? So the idea is that we could have a good account of morality, let's say, which reduced it to and explained, our practices of usages of the word and all this other stuff, right? In terms of some natural fact that has nothing to do with reasons, and you would still reject that account, or at least find that it's insufficient. I guess my question would be, at that point, what are we trying to do with our accounts? It seems to me that we're trying to account for what we're trying to do is essentially, someone asks, we got this thing of goodness. We use the term good or similar terms in all of these different ways. We have these views about it. What's with that? How can we understand this? Particularly when there's often inconsistencies and people disagree. We're trying to give an account for how to make sense of all that, right? And how to produce a more consistent, coherent usage of the term. It seems to me that suppose we did that, right? I would say job done. That's it. But it's almost like you're saying, maybe I misunderstood you, but it's almost like you're saying we could have that, and you would still think that there's a question to answer, or that there's more to say. I'm just not sure what facts of the matter there could be outside of that.
Well, I mean, to the extent that we figure out that semantically what goodness is generally talking about does not relate to reasons, but relates to some natural fact. So I mean, to take like, you know, a pretty trivial example, like when religious people argue about which thing is correct, like maybe they're just arguing about which of the divine dictates it was in fact, you know, commanded by a divine being. And I don't think that any of the divine dictates were commanded by any divine being. But so if we gave an account like that, where morality was reducible to some sort of naturalistic property, like the sort of like, you know, which is the real divine being, and what did they say about things? I mean, I think that would be, you know, quite useful, like pragmatically in terms of linguistics. But if it didn't provide us with reasons to care about them, then I mean, like by definition, we would have no reason to care about the implications. So even if we had an adequate account of how we use moral language, that said that something is good, but we had no reason to try to bring it about, then that would seem to be impotent.
Yeah, right. So then at that point, well, I'm not sure about the word impotent, but the rest of that. But at that point, you're asking for a theory of normativity or reasons, not a theory of goodness. And so I would say, well, then we need to address that question, like in virtue of what are reasons, and in virtue of what do we have them, if anything, right? And so then we give that account. There's also one clarification. I don't think it's just about semantics, right? I mean, that depends on exactly how we define those terms. But I think it's more than that. It's more than just sort of what's embedded in the meaning. It's also about, I guess, the pragmatics of it, and that's why I say that it's practice and discourse. It's not just what's sort of the semantic core of a term. That's one of the reasons you can't, I don't think, work this out just by thinking about it. You have to do sort of empirical work. But I don't know that that's crucial for our disagreement here. But yeah, so I would say, okay, so you think that just giving this sort of reductive account of goodness isn't enough, because we want to know, well, why do I care? Okay, so then let's proceed to do the same project with respect to reasons and or rationality or normativity, something like that. We try to work out what reasons are, or what we're talking about, and what we might be referring to in reasons discourse broadly. And that's obviously a hard project, right? But suppose we did that and we found some naturalistic thing that reasons are, aren't we finished?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we could give a
or we find that there is no plausible account, and in which case, well, we presumably should reform discourse. I mean, different people have different views about that, but
sure. I mean, if we could give a naturalistic account of what reasons are that's able to preserve their normativity, and I actually think that it's possible that there is a naturalistic account, and if there was if it was like. If there was a way of coming up with a perfectly naturalistic account that's able to sort of have reasons that have this sort of reason-giving force that count in favor of whatever their reasons for, etc., which to me seems unlikely, but not wholly implausible, then I think I would accept ethical naturalism.
But yeah, I mean, I think that follows. But the question is, why do you assume that it has to have all of those properties? So that wasn't my criteria. The criteria was, we take as, maybe not primitive, I don't entirely like that, but we take as a starting point pre-theoretic, which essentially means like not what the philosophers say, but just general practice about normativity and reasons and things like that. How it's typically used in a variety of contexts, in different ways, obviously, not just one person's intuition. That's the starting point, and we give an account of that. And that may the count at the end may be reforming, like Railton says this about morality. He's trying to he thinks of it as a reforming account, which means it's not going to fit exactly with all our pre-theoretic intuitions. There's probably going to be confusions there, or views that we had that weren't quite right. So there's going to be some sort of process of iterative fitting, of reflective equilibrium, I think, between our sort of pre-theoretic practices and discourse around a concept and what a good philosophical theory of it's going to be. But at some point, supposing we can sort of reach a fit there, I think that the result of that would be what we should accept as a good philosophical account. And I don't think that we can assume at the outset that it's going to have a particular sort of checklist of properties like you identify, because maybe those are confused, or maybe that's not what actually our practices assume. So I guess that I would say, like, how do we know at the outset that we sort of have to have those? I mean, maybe, I'm not saying we don't, right? But that's, I think, where I differ.
When you say those, I'm not sure what
The
you're...
things that you mentioned before. So you said something about I'm trying to remember the exact words you used. Reasons giving
The,
force, I think, was one of them, and
like counting in favor relation.
oh yeah, you said counting in favor of, yeah, that's one. So I'm not taking a position on whether we have those or not, right? But I wouldn't want to. It's sort of not obvious that those are sort of must-haves, right? I would want to say, well, that's an empirical question about how the term is used and what the discourse looks like. So when do we talk about people having reasons for things? Like I think that whatever the account of rationality is going to look like, that account is true in virtue of a combination of broadly sort of socio-semantic facts about the usage of the term, plus other facts of the world that might be relevant.
Well,
and that's maybe where just to clarify, that's maybe where I have a problem with non-naturalism, because it seems that they just want to pull in, again, obviously this is the crude naturalist way of putting it, but they just want to pull in these sort of primitives that sort of do something that they want in the theory, like give us reasons or something, but don't seem to connect to anything else that we know about in the world. And that just doesn't seem to make sense to me. It seems like that we start with empirical subjects in the world plus the phenomena of interest, and we give an account of that. And stipulating these primitive entities seems to be a bit ad hoc to me. So yeah,
sure.
Tell me where I've gone wrong there.
Well, so I think that I mean, I think that I'm coming back again to the sort of epistemic reasons case. So like, it seems like if we gave an account of epistemic reasons where, like, I don't know, where epistemic reasons were some, let's see, what's a good, where epistemic reasons were just describing some sort of like purely naturalistic property about like human brains or something. Like it seems like at that point, that sort of robs like epistemic reasons of their kind of reason giving force, the same way that I think that.
Well, first of all, what do we mean by that, and do we need to have that? But also, then does it? Like, I think that's just all. That's all the question, right? I don't know. Again, I don't know what exactly you mean by reasons giving force, and I would want to say that we need to unpack that a bit more. But also, it's not clear that we have to have that. Maybe the correct account looks a little different. And then just to sort of add to that, just sort of stipulating that these things exist or something like that exists primitively, I don't think that's a good account. I think that that's just sort of defining into existence. Again, I'm not claiming this is a fair characterization. I'm saying that this is how I see it. It's sort of defining into existence the things that we want our theory to explain. I don't think it's a good theory. Maybe the naturalist doesn't have a better theory. I think that maybe they do, but it still seems a bit ad hoc to me to just say, well, it seems like to us that we should have these sorts of reasons, so we're going to say they're primitives. I don't know how that's a good theory.
Well, so like to the extent that we think based on, you know, scenarios like Future Tuesday and difference, and there are more that I think are like even more counterintuitive, that we think, like just on philosophical grounds, that there ought to be sort of desire independent reasons for things, and we think that an account of reasons where it just says that reasons are reducible to what our desires of some type would be under certain conditions, like to the extent that we think that there are sort of enough intuitions that strongly count against the project that says that there's no deeper account of reasons beyond naturalistic facts, then I think that we would say that that there are sort of that we have non-natural reasons that are not reducible.
Yes, but why? I don't understand this assumption about the probative force of these reasons, right? Because the idea is that sorry, I misspoke there. I don't understand. Let me start again. I don't understand where the probative force of these intuitions comes from, because the idea is that there's these non-natural facts that exist and are primitive, or at least some of them are primitive. And presumably our intuitions are in some way accessing or entering into some relation with these facts in some form. Otherwise, how do we expect our intuitions to align to the fact of the matter? And I think that we'd like to have at least some account as to how our intuitions access these, but they're supposed to be non-natural facts. So how can they? The epistemics seem all wrong to me. I don't quite understand where the intuitions, why we would think the intuitions are latching onto anything. I tend to think that a lot of these intuitions are probably just confused or have no basis at all. It depends on the intuition, right? But I guess that's why I'm asking you. So how does that work in terms of why should we think that the intuitions have probative force, and how do they link up to or latch onto these non-natural facts?
Well, so I think that the things that we think we have reason to do. So the reasons are describing facts about particular natural properties. So like I don't think that like the fact that suffering is bad, I don't think that that's some like optional extra about suffering. I think that that's sort of a necessary component of suffering that we have.
So that's a natural fact then.
Well, so, I don't know that it is a natural fact. Like, so,
well, in virtue of which, this is what I don't quite understand. If it's a natural fact, then it seems that we're basically agreeing. But if it's not, then what sort of fact is it, and how does it relate to it seems like then it has to be something extra, right? If you specify the natural state of affairs, and then you say, well, there's no morality there, you got to say there's something extra that's non-natural. Well, but then how is that not extra? Again, maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm not seeing that. Doesn't make sense to me.
Well, so I think that the like sort of technicalities of at what point of like where it goes from being a natural fact to a non-natural fact are kind of yeah.
Well, I'm not asking exactly where it goes. I'm trying to understand the connection between them, right? Because what I would, the sort of account I would pursue as a naturalist would be a reduction to natural. I mean, I think all facts are natural, right? But a reduction to maybe more basic natural facts. But you have said that you think that there are, let's say, normative facts that are not natural and are primitive, and that does seem like it's going to be something above and beyond, or at least different to the sorts of natural facts that I would be happy to appeal to, which basically are, say, facts about well-being of creatures plus facts about discourse and concepts that we have. So brain facts and social facts, these are all the sorts of things that I'm going to want to put into the basket. It seems that what you said is, yeah, you can put all that there, but there's these intuitions as well that we need to use as probative evidence for these facts that go beyond the natural facts. And I'm just not quite seeing how we have access to, how our intuitions connect to anything else that's beyond the natural facts.
Well, so I think that properties that it would have that I think a naturalistic account would say that it would not have would be, one, that I think that a fully idealized agent or a fully rational agent would necessarily desire its avoidance, and so it's not a sort of contingent fact that could be different in any possible world. It's true across all possible worlds. And so, and it doesn't seem to be reducible, like the undesirability of suffering. It just seems to be something about suffering. It doesn't seem to be reducible. When I said there was, sorry, good.
Well, no, I was just going to say it seems to be something about suffering. I would say, I'm not sure about that specific account of that being necessary truth, but broadly speaking, I might agree with that. But I would say, no, it is reducible. It's reducible to the semantics and pragmatics and discourse of suffering as a concept, and at not just a concept, but as a deployed, I like to say the discourse surrounding that. I don't know how that's a primitive, because that ultimately, as a naturalist, I'm going to say that's a brain state, or maybe not one brain state, but lots of brain states combined with the way that they interact with each other. So that relates to the notion of suffering and what suffering is, plus probably some other facts about suffering that go beyond merely our understanding of it. But you see what I'm saying? To me, that just very straightforward. Well, I shouldn't say very straightforward, but to me, that maps to a bunch of natural facts. I don't see it as a primitive. Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean by primitive.
Well, wait. So I guess I'm not sure what natural facts you think on my account, its badness would be true in virtue of.
Hang on, its badness. So what are we talking about here?
So you seem to be suggesting that on my account, the badness of suffering is a reducible natural fact.
Yeah. So you said something like suffering. Suffering is something such that, or maybe it's not something. Maybe you could just say it again, because I'm not sure my paraphrase would. But you said something about it being a necessary truth that a rational agent would avoid it, or something like that. So you were talking about suffering, right?
Yeah, I think that a necessary fact about suffering is that it would be.
Yeah, that's right. So and you said a necessary fact about suffering is that a fully rational agent would avoid it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's good. Would you call that a normative fact or a moral fact?
I would say that is a fact in virtue of which, like, that's a fact relating to how it provides reasons.
Yeah. Okay. So that's fine.
Normativity is emergent.
Yeah. Okay. So then the question is, what does that fact let's look at that fact now. That fact about suffering being being such that a rational agent would avoid it. Is that true in virtue of anything else, or is that primitive? And I would say that is true in virtue of other things. What is it true in virtue of? Well, first of all, it's true in virtue of a whole bunch of the nature of a whole bunch of physical states that are suffering states. So maybe we start talking about qualia, but I think that's ultimately going to be physical, right? So the fact of what it is like to experience certain physical states seems to be grounding what you've just said about suffering, plus a whole bunch of facts about the idea of suffering. Like, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the bad aspects of these types of experiences, right? So you sort of put all that together. Obviously, there's a complicated story to tell there, which we don't fully understand. But it seems that is why an idealized rational agent would have a reason, or would necessarily have a reason, to not suffer. It's because of facts about suffering as manifested in the world, plus our idea of what suffering is. Like, if suffering meant a blade of grass, then this obviously would, surely it's something about the meaning of the term, plus how it's used in practice, and plus the referent of that term. Like, so it seems that there's more that can be unpacked there. It doesn't seem right for me to call that a primitive.
Well, wait. I think, like, I spaced out a little bit for, like, the first part of the explanation.
Yeah, well, I went on for a little bit, but let me approach it a different way. So if I ask you, look, why are you so sure that a rational agent always has a reason to not want to suffer, and particularly focusing on the suffering part? Like, what is it about suffering that gives them that? It seems that under your account, there's simply nothing to say. Whereas I think, of course, there are things to say. You can say, look, well, what do we mean by suffering? Suffering is, stuff that feels bad, and you can talk about it, what it feels like. You could say, look, suffering includes these sorts of pains and these experiences and blah, blah, blah. You could say all of this stuff. And so in virtue of all of this understanding that we have about suffering and what it refers to and how we use the term and blah, 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 that's why a rational agent has a reason not to suffer. It's not just a primitive, is it?
Well, wait, so when you said all this stuff, so the things that you invoked were, like, so
anything that you want to say about suffering, like literally any true things, I guess, that you want to say about suffering, let's say.
I mean, the all the true things to be said about suffering, other than just sort of that it, like, feels bad, don't seem to explain the reason we have for not wanting to suffer. I'm like, can you
really?
give a few specific examples of?
So it seems to me that I have a reason for not wanting to suffer because I've experienced certain types of suffering. I know what that experience is like, and that is what gives me the reason to not want to experience it again. So it's not just a primitive that I have a reason that I don't want to experience suffering. I can ground that in virtue of certain experiences that I've had.
Well, sure, but
partly. That's not all it's going to be, but that's part of it.
Sure, but even one who had not previously experienced suffering, it still seems like their idealized self would not want them to experience suffering.
Sure, because their idealized self would also know about those experiences.
Well, right. I think that knowledge of the experience is how we become aware of the badness of suffering. But
yeah, exactly. But the experience itself is what grounds it. That's what I would say, or maybe aspects of the experience, and maybe we start talking about qualia at that point. But the point is, I just don't see how you can say it's. I don't see how it makes sense to say it's a primitive that suffering is just bad. There are facts about suffering and what it is in the world, in virtue of which it is bad. Like actual states of suffering, not just sort of suffering.
Well, but the example that you gave, I think, was how we
because suffering is a natural phenomenon. I guess that's what suffering is, a natural phenomenon. So natural facts about the suffering as a phenomenon is what grounds these, was what could plausibly at least ground these sort of statements that you're making about idealized agents having reason to not do it.
Well, sure. I agree that it's a natural phenomenon, but like much like a mathematical Platonist would say that like 1 + 1 = 2, such that if you had one thing and you added another thing, you would have a total of two things. That while it's true that it's sort of describing natural properties, the element of it is not sort of contingent on natural facts. Though if the account is just if the account is that the bad, like if you would consider it to be moral naturalism, an account that says that suffering is that something about suffering makes it so that all possible agents would not all possible idealized agents would want to not suffer. If you would
have reason to. Oh, but it doesn't matter. It's just an example.
Sure. I mean, if you would consider that to be naturalism, then
what's not natural about that? I don't have to appeal to anything that's not natural. This is what I'm not understanding what the non-natural entities or facts are supposed to be doing in the account. Maybe that's the issue, because it seems to me that suffering is just a good old natural property or set of states of affairs or something. Likewise, our concepts about it also are. And those are the ingredients which we use to construct these accounts. I don't know that we need to invoke anything beyond that. Now, certain truths about them may be necessary, but I don't see those as non-natural either. Now, to take the example of mathematical Platonism, I think that the example is sort of clear there, because there is, at least the way I understand it, a stipulation that there are entities, like real things, not physical things, but real things that our mathematical or logical discourse refers to. I don't believe in such things. For various reasons we could talk about it, like I'd invoke an epistemic argument as to how we have access to them. But I would say also we just don't need them. And in a case of, I think it's maybe even easier in the case of suffering, because while numbers may or may not be a natural, something you can ground naturally, depending on how you think about such things. But I think suffering more straightforwardly is. So at any rate, I guess the point is, I don't believe in Platonic sort of entities, and I'm not sure why invoking them, particularly in this ethical case here, I don't want to get distracted by mathematical Platonism, right? But as an example, I don't know why what invoking them is supposed to do to our account, or add to our account, I mean.
Well, so I mean, I think that the talk about naturalism versus non-naturalism, I think, gets somewhat muddled.
Sure.
But I mean, my view is that there is something about suffering that makes it so that a fully rational entity would necessarily be averse to it. When we use moral language, we're trying to figure out what, if we were like fully rational and impartial, what things we would care about. Though, and so if I mean, it seems like that is more commonly classified as to the extent that you think that the relationship between suffering and being necessarily aversive is like that's not a natural property. There's no like additional natural property that makes suffering necessarily aversive for a fully rational being. It's just sort of a necessary like element of suffering. But to the extent that my view would be that there's just some element of suffering that makes it intrinsically bad. We have kind of like sort of direct awareness of the badness of suffering when we experience suffering.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. There's nothing as a naturalist. But the thing is, you said before that natural accounts, say, of normativity or goodness seem to be missing something. They rob it of normative force and things like that. Whereas now it seems like maybe it's just an issue of what we're focusing on. I'm not sure what the naturalist is missing here. Like, it seems to me that, and I'm also a little unsure about what the intuitions are adding. So what I would say is my intuition about what any possible agent would find aversive or not is irrelevant. I don't know why I should expect to have access to that. That's the epistemic objection that I raised before. What I would say is, it seems, well, maybe it's not entirely relevant. Maybe I'm slightly too strong there. Based on my experience plus people I talk to, I guess trying to put myself in other people's shoes, it does seem hard to imagine, seems quite hard to imagine how there could be an agent that would just intrinsically like suffering. I don't know that that's logically impossible, though. And so if you ask me about, let's imagine giving the entire repertoire of possible agents, all uncountably infinitely many of them, as I presume there would be, can I say that there are exactly 0 of them that would have some kind of intrinsic preference for suffering? I don't know how I can rule that out, right? I don't think the only way I think I could rule that out is to say that it's logically contradictory. And I'm not sure that it is. Maybe I could be wrong that there's some aspect of the concepts that I've missed, right? But if we say that it's not like logically contradictory, then my intuition that it just couldn't happen, what's that worth? I don't understand why we're sort of licensed to postulate that this necessity pertains just because we have an intuition that it should. That's maybe where I don't see how our intuitions are mapping to anything there.
Well, so I think that, I think that like you could make it sort of a similar claim in the epistemic case. So like you could similarly say like, okay, how would we make the claim that all rational agents, all rational idealized agents would, if presented like the evidence that we have right now, like, and they read all the available evidence, how could we be certain that all idealized versions of themselves would conclude that like the Earth is round? And I think that the reason we
couldn't, surely.
Well, with full information about
that's a tricky one, because full information includes the fact that the Earth is round, right? But
with full access to the information that we have now about the roundness of the Earth,
the evidence, yeah.
So
a fully rational agent with the information we have now about the roundness of the Earth, yeah.
Yeah. Wait, I mean, it seems like the rational agents have to be responsive to reasons, and based on the evidence that gives us that would give them all decisive reasons to conclude that the Earth is round.
Yeah, I agree, but now we're talking about so I think I agree there. It seems to me that the way I would use the term rational is a little different there. Oh, no, that's not quite right. The account that I would give of rationality, I think, is a little different. I think that rationality does require responsiveness to reasons. I think that, well, pretty much everyone agrees with that, I think. And it does seem to me that someone with access to our current evidence of the Earth's roundness who did not conclude that the Earth was round would be irrational. And the question is, well, what account would I give of that? And what I would do is I would give an account as to particularly epistemic rationality and what that consists in. And, you know, then we have a long discussion about epistemology, right? But I'm not going to at any point appeal to anything that's beyond, you know, brains and discourse and the good old fashioned natural facts that I've been talking about, right? So, but now let's take that back to the case of normativity in terms of of an agent who doesn't have a well, maybe this is the issue, who doesn't have an idealization that doesn't have a preference for not suffering, or who doesn't have a preference for not suffering. Now, the way I would cash out the notion of idealized preferences, I guess this is maybe the issue here, is different to the way I would try to cash out epistemic normativity. So I'm going to give a different answer there, at least potentially. As I've said, I am open to a further revision of what I would have to say about idealized preferences. Maybe there's more things that I'm missing there. But what I don't think, I guess here's here's where I differ. It seems that there's two intuitions we have. In the epistemic space, we have this intuition that someone who had access to all of the facts about all of the evidence we have about the world would conclude that it's round if they're rational. In the other case, we have an intuition that future Tuesday indifference is irrational. Like no rational agent could have that. So those are those two intuitions. I would say, okay, let's take those intuitions. Certainly they're worth starting with. Let's see how our accounts go that we construct on the basis of these intuitions. And I would say that in the epistemic case, I think it's pretty well relatively. We can construct an account that of epistemology that basically allows us to hold to that intuition, or at least affirm the what that intuition is saying. Now, but let's look at the case of the idealized preferences. Can we similarly construct an account? It's less clear to me. I'm not saying we can't. As I said, I'm sort of open there, but it's less clear to me because here we're talking about preferences of agents, not about epistemic structure of evidence. And to me, those are different things. I mean, I understand you may see it differently, but I'm just saying, to me, the accounts are looking different. And so I have the judgment where I think it needs to stay open as to whether it's possible for an agent to have those preferences. What I wouldn't want to say is that because we have the intuition, the account must agree with that. I say the intuition is a starting point for our approach. It's not something that we can assume will be just correct. Basically, I don't understand that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, you know, being a utilitarian, there are some bullets that we have to bite that seem unintuitive at first. But I think so. I agree that we should not just unreflectively accept the intuitions merely because something seems intuitive or unintuitive.
Well, I'm going further than that. I would say we should not even reflectively accept. I say that intuitions themselves don't have intuitions about counterfactual states like this don't have much of any epistemic value.
Well,
they don't help us to know whether facts exist. Like, I don't know how you can say that. Sorry, I'm interrupted, but I just want to clarify what I'm saying here. It seems that the non-naturalist wants to be able to validate, let's say, necessary facts about what hypothetical agents would want on the basis of intuitions. And that's where I say intuitions can't tell you that.
Well, so I mean, I think that the sort of fundamental intuition behind all of the cases like future Tuesday indifference and such, which explain why those intuitions are likely to be informative, it is that sort of something about suffering gives us reason to not want to suffer. And so to the extent that we think that we have sort of awareness of that via the experience of suffering, given that other beings would experience suffering in the same way, or at least, you know, that we would stipulate that they would still have the constitutive features required for suffering. It seems like we could similarly come to conclusions that they would also have to that suffering would also be bad. And I think that there are other it's not just on the basis of intuitions that I think that this account is plausible. So one reason why I think this is plausible, and I won't go too much into the details here, but is that I think that if for a lot of the sort of ethical thought experiments, particularly the ones that are levied as counterexamples to utilitarianism, I actually think that there are, like, basically universally just decisive reasons to accept the utilitarian conclusion. And so if in like nearly every case we can just reason our way to accept the utilitarian conclusion on independent grounds, that seems to provide evidence for, like, sort of reason leading us to utilitarianism. And we can similarly, like, criticize the other accounts, and
Yeah, sure. I'm fine with all of that. I guess what you said about suffering is, I mean, I quite like it, actually. It's not a sort of way that I thought about it before, which is that there is something about suffering in virtue of which a rational agent would have a reason, at least, or maybe preference, I don't know if those are the same, to not experience that. So supposing that we said that that's true, I think that, I guess what I'm saying is, I think the naturalist could embrace that and then use that as an account for, well, an idealized agent wouldn't have, let's say, next Tuesdaysm or something, right? Because obviously the idealized agent would know about what suffering was like, that's part of the idealization. And that knowledge would give them the reasons, or at least let's say the preference, the idealized preference to not experience that. So coming back to that, I don't see the problem with that. Maybe there's a bit more to unpack in the details, right? But why can't the naturalist just appeal to the same move? I guess is the question.
Well, if one who makes that move would still be called a naturalist, then I would be perfectly happy calling myself a naturalist.
But what's, again, when I say naturalist, I have it's just physical stuff that the natural sciences can study, at least in principle, right? I'm not saying that natural sciences are currently complete, but so I have a fairly reductionist view about that. And if there's something that I'm missing that, this is the genuine question, if there's something that I'm missing that, for example, as that type of naturalist, I don't think I can commit to Platonic forms, right? I think that would be, so I know some people who are Platonists call themselves naturalists. I'm not stipulating that. I'm saying as my type of reductive naturalist, I don't think I could commit to Platonic forms. And so if someone had an argument that those things should exist, then that would be inconsistent with the way I think about stuff that exists, right? But now, coming to our case that we've been talking about, is there considerations in virtue of which I should move away from my reduction naturalist view in these sort of normative questions? It seems that in the example that's been given, I can understand suffering as a natural phenomena, and that there are aspects of that give people reasons to at least idealize reasons to hold preferences against experiencing it. It's not clear to me what pulls me away from the sort of reductive naturalist view there. So the question is, am I missing something there?
I didn't think that you are missing something. Like, to the extent that you held the view that all possible agents would necessarily find suffering to be, or all like possible fully rational agents would necessarily find suffering to be something that's aversive.
At least their idealized selves would.
Yeah.
No, you said rational, so I guess that. Yeah.
Right. I would if that was your view, I would have zero disagreements beyond just the naturalists and moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism seem like they are, much like many concepts in philosophy, notoriously difficult to define. And to me, that just intuitively, based on what I've read from other non-naturalists, that just intuitively seems to be more in the non-naturalist camp. But I would have zero substantive disagreements with the person who held that view.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the point here is not to sort of definitively classify views as one or the other, but I'm trying to understand better, because I do find non-naturalism a bit hard to understand sometimes. And in the case of Platonism, I think that there is substantive disagreement there, but it doesn't appear that you're appealing to any kind of Platonic forms here, or something analogous to that we've been talking about. I think one difference is that I am still uncomfortable with this sort of appeals to intuition and hypotheticals that you've been appealing to. And I would still say that those aren't definitive. I don't find them that, like the next Tuesdaysism, I would say that I don't find that especially persuasive. However, I would say that it does seem plausible to me that there are aspects of or features of suffering in virtue of which an idealized agent would necessarily have reasons to avoid that. I wouldn't firmly commit myself to that, right? I think what I would want to, and this is maybe where the naturalism comes, I would like us to understand suffering better, like in terms of everywhere from like the social and cognitive to the neuroscientific aspects of it, to make a sort of a necessary claim like that. But I'm happy with the notion of necessary supervenience relations, right? I think most reductive naturalists probably have to be in order to, unless they're like a limitivist about everything, right? So, for example, certain mental states necessarily supervene on certain types of physical states, right? So the fact that there could be these sorts of reasons that necessarily supervene on or occur as a result of certain physical states that are suffering states, that in principle, I don't see as a problem. I guess some people may prefer to describe that relation as a non-natural relation, but to me, that's not how I would describe it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that I think, in good naturalistic fashion, I think we've been able to provide a fairly reductionist account of what our disagreement, which is like basically to the extent that you come to accept the view that you're sort of uncertain about, that all fully idealized rational agents will find suffering to be undesirable, would want not to suffer, then the only difference would just be what we call our views. But if you consider necessary supervenience to be non-natural, then I think that we would be in agreement.
Yeah, well, supervenience is also kind of I mean, I guess all these notions are problematic, but yeah, I guess there are certain types of naturalists who are going to be like really eliminativist about things. The Churchlands would be one example. I'm not entirely sure about Dennett. I find his views a little hard to understand, but so some brands of naturalism would say no, you can't have these sorts of things. And if you go down that road, I think that you do. Honestly, I think even things like governments and social relations become sort of hard to understand, because I think that yeah, I just think this notion of supervenience on lower states is, I don't see it as problematic. As long as, I guess what I see naturalism is saying is that fundamentally everything is the sort of thing, or made of the sort of thing, that can be studied through the natural sciences. And the best guess is that it's like something like quantum fields. Now that might be wrong. It might turn out to be something else, right? But that's our best guess as to what it looks like. Now, if one wants to, insofar as one then begins to stipulate additional fundamental aspects to reality, such as gods or immaterial minds or Platonic forms, I would say that's outside of how I'm using the term naturalism here. But because necessary supervenience relations they're not a fundamental thing, that there's just basically a relation between states of affairs. At least that's how I see it. I don't see that as, I don't see that as a problem as a naturalist. I don't know.
Yeah. On the consciousness point, my friend has a joke about Dennett's book. So Dennett's book is Consciousness Explained. So my friend jokes about how that it should have been called Consciousness Explained Away.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. I haven't read his book. I need to understand better, but I continually hear inconsistent things about what Dennett thinks about consciousness. So I'm not entirely sure there. Well, that was interesting. I don't know if you wanted to talk. Probably should go soonish, but if you wanted to talk briefly about any EA stuff, I know you mentioned that in the when you contacted me.
You were less concerned about AI risk, you thought, than like Ord. Yeah. So I was, in preparing for the discussion, like I was thinking of doing a lot of research about AI, because I mean I think that I don't have super strong views. My views are basically that I just sort of trust the consensus of effective altruists on the matter, just sort of the reflective equilibrium. Given that I am not super knowledgeable about the domain, and so, but I don't think that I have sufficient like domain specific knowledge of AI to be able to provide.
That's fine. I mean, a lot of my objections, I wouldn't really say that they're domain specific. Like, I think one of my meta criticisms is that there's too much focus on technical AI work in the EA community, and not enough on what I guess I might say are the socio-political aspects and, I guess more, I don't even know how to describe some of them, more practical aspects. Logistical is one of them. But yeah, I mean, so I've written a few posts on the EA forum. For those, I don't know if you've read any of them, but also just for our listeners, if they're interested. I don't know that we want to go into a whole lot of the details now. I guess maybe the meta point is that certain effective altruists talk about super intelligence as if it would be basically omnipotent. Now, that's a bit of a straw man, because they don't say it's omnipotent, right? But this is my characterization of what I see as the flaw of the argument, right? So an example of this sort of line of thinking is when EAs will talk about the idea that, look, if you had a super intelligence, then they could buy resources and things off the internet and hire people to do stuff for it. They could use that to develop very powerful new technologies, like nanobots is an example that's sometimes given, or whatever else. And they could use that then to gain access to more of the world's resources and sort of take over. Now they present this as a sort of an illustrative example. They say, well, probably it would do something a lot cleverer than that, right? But my point is not the specifics of cases like that. It's simply that I feel like the way that intelligence is sometimes conceptualized is just ignores practical, logistic, and political considerations. So one objection I give is that if an AI was to develop any substantive new technology, such as nanotechnology or viruses or really anything, computer power is not sufficient for that. You can do a lot in simulations, but there are fundamental limits as to what you can simulate because of exponential, what I'm trying to say here, exponentially increasing costs of running various types of simulations. Like if you want to understand how a protein the structure and function of a protein. You can't just, being intelligent doesn't by itself allow you to do that. You need to have you need to do empirical tests, essentially. And those tests, apart from requiring resources, take time and particular facilities. And those facilities would have to be built, and the raw materials of them have to be brought in, and the reagents have to be, and all of that. Now, even if you're super intelligent, you may be able to do that really a lot faster than other people. But at the end of the day, you're still going to need to collect data and interact with the physical world. And all of that's going to take time. And then this mitigates against these ideas that the super intelligence could gain a technological lead. I forget exactly what, there's a term for this that Ord uses in superintelligence that I forget what he says, but that it could gain this kind of overwhelming lead or dramatic power over humanity in a very short period of time. It seems to me that
is the term FOOM?
FOOM is, I think that's a term that Eliezer uses to talk about the rapidity of the takeoff. There's a different term that Ord, pretty sure it's Ord, uses to talk about the fact that the AI would basically be in charge of the world, like that they would have a dominant power over what happened to humanity. I've forgotten what that term he uses is, but my criticism is that it essentially treats intelligence as if it's the only relevant variable into power. In fact, some EAs are explicit in relating power and intelligence. What I would say is that intelligence is an important component of power, but it's by no means all that there is to it. There are many things you need to get power, and just being really intelligent is not sufficient. Even if you include things like emotional intelligence and being able to manipulate people. And that, by the way, it's not clear that that would immediately follow from some types of reinforcement learning AI that are discussed, that it would to sort of have those abilities. But even if you say, well, it could then develop those, even that kind of is not sufficient, right? You actually need to gather the resources, and then you have to have the logistics to support it. You have to have a way to project that power. At the end of the day, the AI would need a way of defeating Earth's military forces to actually gain full control, right? And that's going to require a level of technology that it has to develop. So I know this is sort of a bit vague, but this is talking generalities of points that I think are neglected in a lot of EA treatments of the topic, where they talk as if being superintelligence is sort of the end point of achieving power over humanity's future. And what I say is that there's a lot more to that than just the superintelligence, and that we need to investigate these aspects as well.
Yeah, I mean, that seems plausible. I think that I'll, to be honest, am not sufficiently knowledgeable about the details of AI to be able to sort of know if that's an adequate response. And so generally,
that's fine. I was just articulating some of it. I'm not asking you to,
yeah.
Although there's obviously more to say, but I just wanted to give a summary of some of that. And if people are interested, they can check out the articles that I wrote on the Effective Altruism forum.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
If you'd be interested in discussing it, I'd be interested in asking you a little bit about consciousness.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So you said, so you sort of disagreed with the like Churchland style reductionism about consciousness. So I'd be curious as to what your naturalistic account is of consciousness. I ask as someone who recently was sort of introduced to the philosophical problems of consciousness, and I'm currently deeply confused. And all of the theories seem to run into big problems. So,
well, just when we're talking about consciousness, which are you particularly interested in, qualia or other? Because consciousness is used to refer to different things.
I mean consciousness,
subjective experience.
I mean consciousness in the sort of Nagel sense of like what it's like to be something.
That's what I mean. Subjective experience, quality. Okay. Because I think that's where the other aspects of consciousness I think are a lot easier to account for, but it's just sometimes we got to be careful about word usage there, because we might be borrowing intuitions based on different usages. But anyway, so qualia. Again, I'm still trying to learn more about this. I wouldn't say I have a very firm view. I think that there are a number of problems with the with some of the arguments that's typically given. First and foremost, I don't see that. I think there is a hard problem in the sense that we still don't really know how or why any physical state has subjective experience. So in that sense, there's a hard problem. But some people, like Nagel would be an example, want to use that as an argument, and some substantialists as well want to use that as an argument against naturalism. And that's where I think that well, I just don't think the argument's very good, right? As a naturalist, I'd want to say, look, the question's an open one. We don't know. We're going to have to wait for our neuroscience and cognitive psychology and whatever else to tell us more about how this works. But the arguments that try to establish that sort of that can't happen, or that it's impossible that you can have this under naturalism, or highly improbable or something, I just don't quite see their force. So if we're to say, for example, that there's always, I mean, so you can make a kind of one example would be the p-zombie argument, right? That you can have a physical replica of, say, a person who just wouldn't, there'd be no one home, so to speak, that there would be no subjective experience. So the fact that such things are conceivable, I mean, some philosophers debate whether they're conceivable. I don't even know what all that debate's about, what conceivability means. But whether or not it's conceivable that you could have a p-zombie, I don't think p-zombies are metaphysically possible. If you had a physical duplicate of a human, then I think you would have the same subjective experience. So my best account would be that there's a necessary supervenous relation between mental states, including qualia, and the physical substrate. So I'm not saying I can prove that, right? But as a naturalist, that would be a natural claim that I would make. And I don't see that we have good evidence that that is wrong. So at that point, I see that it's just sort of a stalemate, right? I'm not saying I can prove that that's right, but I don't think that there's a good argument against it either. So I don't think the p-zombie argument is a good argument for thinking that materialism sort of must be false. And then there are arguments about inconsistent properties. So go ahead.
Yeah. So on the p-zombie argument, so in terms of the metaphysical impossibility point, so like it seems like for something to be metaphysically impossible, like there has to be some explanation for why it's metaphysically possible, or sorry, metaphysically impossible. So like, you know, if it entails a contradiction, that means it's logically impossible. It should also mean that it's metaphysically impossible. But so do you think that there's any like deeper account of why it would be metaphysically impossible? Or
well, the account is because certain physical states, at least brain states, produce qualia. And so if you make a copy of that, then the qualia follow. That's the account. Now you ask, yeah, but why is it that the particular types of brain states give rise to qualia? And that's just asking me to solve the hard problem, right? Well, I don't know. We're going to have to wait our scientific. We're going to have to await our science to find the answer to that. But should I think that it's not the case that our brain gives rise to qualia? I think that we have good reasons to think that at least that it does, and that's what I would use as justification for the necessary supervenience. I'm not sure that there's a good argument against that. It just seems to me that some people think that there could be p-zombies, but I mean, I don't find those intuitions very convincing.
Yeah. So I think that the p-zombie argument. So like if you think that that there's something about the physical world that necessitates the existence of consciousness emerging from brains, then that, and even if we don't know what it is, that it seems like that would provide an adequate account of why it would be metaphysically impossible. What is there more you want to say on the p-zombie point? If not,
well, not really. Although I would also say that I think that this comes to the issue of what your priors are. So if someone thinks that p-zombies are possible, I think that we sort of deserve an account of that as well. I think anyone making a claim like that, it's reasonable to ask sort of how they support that claim. And I say that although I can't establish the possibility claim, what I would say is we do have good reason for thinking that the brain produces qualia, or certain types of brain states produce qualia more specifically. And I think that that's as good a reason as we sort of have available at the moment as for why we should have a particular view about the modal properties of consciousness, right? For someone, because the counter argument is simply that it's conceivable that you could have a p-zombie, and to me that's just a much weaker argument than all the reasons we have for thinking that brains produce qualia.
Yeah. So I'd be curious in hearing what you would think about the Mary's room argument.
So I want to be again still in the process of reading through the responses to this to be able to articulate my position more clearly. But I mean, yeah, I think that there are types of facts that, or no, let me rephrase it. There are types of knowledge that don't reduce to declarative knowledge or propositional knowledge. So there's a type of knowledge that's what we might call experiential knowledge. And to have that, you basically have to have the right experience, or another way to say that would be you have to be the right sort of thing to have that experience, at least in its full. You might be able to have sort of partial knowledge of that experience. Just like when someone tells you about an experience that you personally haven't had, you can empathize to some extent by analogy with your own experiences. But that's not a full understanding of the experience that they had. You don't have that full knowledge, right? Likewise, I think plausibly, to take Nagel's example, what is it like to be a bat? Could a person ever know what it's like to be a bat, even if they knew all of the physical facts about, how bats work? Plausibly, I think that they would have to be a bat to have that experience, or at least be something very similar to a bat. But that, it seems, is metaphysically impossible because a person can't be a bat. I mean, the structures are different, right? You could maybe have a bat's brain that's sort of connected to your brain, but then that's still not a bat, right? That's a human bat combination of some sort. So basically, I think that there are certain physical systems which, for an agent that is that system, so we're talking about embodied minds here, there is a subjective experience. There is what it is like to be that thing. Knowledge of that experience is not reducible, or sorry, is not derivable from purely propositional facts about the makeup and operation of that system. So Mary wouldn't know what it was like to experience red if she hadn't seen it herself, because she hadn't had that right type of experience. But experiences are physical embodied things, right? There's nothing outside of the physical world that I think we need to invoke. It's just it's invoking the type of agent that has that knowledge. So certain agents may not be capable of having certain types of physical experience, like human agents are not capable of having bat experiences.
Yeah,
plausibly.
That account seems to make a lot of sense. I've had a similar thought, which is that it seems somewhat analogous to sort of conceiving of like higher dimensions, like 4-dimensional objects.
Yeah, I think that's a good example.
Yeah, like it seems like we could know all the mathematical properties of a 4-dimensional object, and even like write down on paper what would, like, sort of the way that we can write down on a 2-dimensional paper a thing that would be seen as that would be 4-dimensional, but absent like actually experiencing a 4-dimensional thing, we don't have knowledge of 4 dimensions, or of like really what it's like.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy, actually. I like that.
Yeah. I think that the account, a sort of Searle-esque account, like a naturalist account that says that you get it from biological processes somehow, we don't know exactly how, is the account that I currently would lean towards. I think that there are, like, the hard problem is in fact hard. But I think that, like, well, it may seem like somewhat unintuitive that all of consciousness can reduce to physical things. Like a lot of things that emerge from other things just don't seem to be immediately reducible to, like, it's not immediately obvious how you get the other thing from the first thing. So, like,
yes,
absent knowing physics, it's like not obvious exactly how you get like heat from like the operation of movement of subatomic particles. But once we understand the mechanisms at a higher level, it becomes obvious. And
all of the operations in your CPU can be reduced to electrons moving between electron bands in semiconductors, plus a few other sort of similar processes, right? And if you were to say, but how do you get all of this complicated information processing from electrons moving between bands? It's just absurd. Like, I think you can run that argument for all sorts of things. Like weather is another example I like to give. I find that those sort of appeals, it's almost appeal to incredulity. And there are philosophers who absolutely do this. They'll say, like, oh, we just have no idea how all of the rich structure of our conscious experience can be reduced to, neurons and patterns of activity in neurons. I'm like, well, no, we don't know that currently. But I feel like you could have said that about many, many other types of these, as you say, supervenous relations. And that's not really an argument for why it can't be. It's just saying that we don't currently understand how. Also, I want to add there that it may well be the case that we never have an answer that is sort of satisfying. And I don't think that should actually be a criteria that we sort of use that as a as a proxy or a rule of thumb about explanations. Like, does it satisfy us? And it can be helpful, I think, if we're calibrated, but it can often go very wrong. There's interesting psychological sort of literature on this about sort of explanations people find satisfying and whether they're actually explanatory. People can often be satisfied by explanations that are completely non-explanatory. And conversely, genuinely explanatory explanations may be very complicated, hard to understand, and people just sort of tune out or reject it, or it doesn't feel like it answers their question. I think that we may well, and we're not there yet, but when neuroscience hopefully gets to the point where we do have a very detailed explanation of how at least human qualia arise, people may still feel like, yeah, but it doesn't explain why it's like that. As you know, and at that point, I think that they're just, at some point, they're just going to be brute facts. Like, well, you know, why is anything like the way it is? Like, why does an electron have a negative charge? I don't know that there could be an answer to that, right? So, you know, and why does a certain pattern of molecular activity give rise to a certain temperature? Well, I don't know. That's sort of the way it is. Like, well, we have an account, but you can still ask why. But it's not clear what the why is doing. Like, imagine you said, look, here is the position and momentum of every single particle in the atmosphere, right? And you said, yeah, but why do we get hurricanes, right? I mean, you could have a full account of how the hurricane emerges from the Coriolis effect and all of the other flows of energy and so forth. But there could still be a subjective sense that you don't really feel like you know why the hurricane emerges. And I feel like that's probably going to be true for qualia as well. So many people may be unsatisfied when hopefully we get to the point where we have this explanation. But I think at some point we're just going to have to say, look, our intuitive idea of what we want of an explanation that it sort of feels explanatory I may be wrong about this. This is just a guess, right? But that may not be what that may never be satisfiable, essentially.
I mean, you know, maybe the explanation will just turn out to be God did it, and then that explains everything.
But the thing is, but that's an interesting point, right? Because some people find a lot of people find that explanatory. I don't think that's explanatory at all. But I talk about this on my channel, right, with Nathan and others. A lot of people do find that is a good explanation, actually, for anything in principle. And I mean, we could talk further about that. But what I would say is, I think that part of an aspect of the hard problem is, what are we looking for in an explanation? What would count? And I feel like that we have to be very careful there that we're not defining that in subjective terms that sort of purely what we feel like would sort of satisfy us. Because a lot of like quantum mechanics, I think, doesn't fit the bill. Quantum mechanics, I mean, it's obviously not complete theory and so forth, but it's not very satisfying for even a lot of physicists, right? There's a lot of weirdness about it. It's counterintuitive and so forth, right? But it's still a good explanation of a bunch of stuff. So I think plausibly, neuroscience, when we get to the point where we can explain how qualia emerge, people will still be unsatisfied. But at that point, I would say, I don't know. I would say that's a you problem. I don't mean other you. Like, I mean, maybe that's a problem with what we're looking for, and not a problem with naturalism.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is sort of worrying about consciousness is that, like, even if we had an adequate explanation of like how we get consciousness in like humans and other biological organisms, it's sort of hard to figure out. I mean, maybe there will be some, like, you know, very elegant and unified account that can just straightforwardly be mapped on to non-biotic life. So, like, you know, if the integrated information theory turned out to be correct, such that just whenever you had integrated information, you got consciousness, and we confirmed that experimentally. We ran a bunch of tests. We saw that the consciousness was necessarily proportional to the integrated information, etc. Then it would be just very easy to figure out how conscious, like, AI would be. But given that consciousness is, on my view, and I think on yours too, the only thing that matters is bringing about desirable conscious states, it's sort of like it's worrying that it is such a difficult question, because
yes,
it's sort of figuring out what beings are possessors of potential moral worth.
Yeah, I agree. And it may be, I'm actually suspicious about whether there will be an overall unified account of all types of subjective experience. I think that it's plausible we could have one for animal life, because we are humans and we can then extend out from there. And there's a lot of evolutionary commonality. But if we talk about machines that are built fundamentally different, like an emulation of the human brain, I think would be all right there. Although I think Searle, I don't know that Searle actually agrees that would be conscious, but I think it would be if it was, again, at a sufficient, I'm getting into too many issues here. It may depend on the way that the simulation is conducted and also the resolution of it. But at least in principle, I think that if it replicates the structure sufficiently well, then that could be conscious. But if we talk about very different forms of experience, like an AI that's built, very different architecture, or maybe aliens that are extremely different from us, it could actually be very hard to know what sort of subjective experience, if any, they had. And because it's not, how to put this, I think that we can give an account in virtue of which our conscious experience arise because we have access to our conscious experiences, because we are the type of beings that have those conscious experiences. We can never be, at least plausibly, maybe there's some sort of neural link or whatever that will develop that allows us to do this, but plausibly we can never be the sort of being that has Vulcan consciousness, where by Vulcan I just mean some very different type of alien, right? Just using that word for sake of argument, right? Plausibly we can never be those type of beings because, well, we're just not. And so how could you get access to what it is like to be one of those things? Like you could build one of those things and talk to it. That might be the best option we have, but there's still going to be an inferential gap in terms of actually possibly one of the best. There's a science fiction story that I read about this, is where you have basically in this story they had a universe where there's many different forms of conscious experience, all sorts of different forms of life and things that are just sort of unimaginable, like clouds of energy or whatever. And the idea is that if you took 2 points that are far apart in this sort of landscape of conscious entities, there was no way for them to even communicate with each other because they're too different. So, but communication could still occur. It just had to be through steps, right? So like two beings that were kind of similar would communicate, and then they would talk to ones along the chain. And so there could be communication, but it just had to occur at sort of in intervals. And perhaps that's a way we could get to it. Like because if we're sufficient, like I'm not the same as you, but I'm sufficiently similar that I'm pretty sure I have insight into broadly what your qualia are like. That's an inference that I make, but I think it's a plausible one, right? And so plausibly we could go down the evolutionary chain like that. We can infer more about a chimpanzee and then so forth. So maybe then if we had ways of sort of intermediating between us and this hypothetical Vulcan or an AI or something like that, like maybe there's a human that has some amount of implants, and then they can mediate with a human that has more or something like that, that we can sort of chain on to understanding what the qualia is like of that being. This is hypothetical, right? But I'm just sort of thinking about how we could actually get access to different subjective states that are not those of beings that are like us. Again, on the supposition that you can't know what those are like without experiencing them or something similar to them. But then you can't just become something, like can't just become a bat, then you're not a person anymore. So I don't know. I think that this will be, I do hope that in the future we'll figure out a way to do this better, which maybe will have significant ethical implications, as you say, right? But at the moment, I think that we're actually, it's probably a bigger problem than we tend to think about very much.
Yeah, that seems like one area where it would be useful, where if it were not so intractable, it would be useful for effective altruists to work on it. I mean,
well, maybe in 100 or 200 years we'll be able to. We're a long way from that at the moment, but I think in principle, probably that will happen, right? I mean, the idea of some of these science fiction accounts is that when human augmentation, genetic or implants or otherwise becomes possible, then people are augmenting themselves all in all sorts of different directions. And then we get a much broader range of different sort of subjective experiences that currently we're kind of clustered pretty tightly in terms of humans, because we're all actually biologically very similar. Obviously, this is sort of sci-fi, right? But sort of thinking about how would we explore the space of subjective experience? Maybe it's through basically bifurcating and having entities that we can communicate with that sort of spread across that space more broadly. And that allows us to sort of iteratively connect inferential distances. But I don't know. That's something we'll have to worry about in the future if we get there. If we get there.
Yeah. One other question I would have, and if you have to go, then that's fine. But what approximately would your credence be in Christian theism?
Well, actually, I've written an article about this. It's a little old now, but I think I would broadly hold to it. So I've said that the probability, like epistemic probability of any type of theism, is about 10%. That's largely based on like Phil Paper's survey. It's rounded a little bit, but I think that's the right order of magnitude. But that's any type of theism. So Christian theism would be a subset of that. Well, most forms of Christianity would be a subset of that. So it's going to be less. And at that point, I just sort of make fairly ad hoc arguments. about that. I think it is any form of Christian theism is not conditional on a generic theism. Christianity is not extremely implausible, but I also don't think it's extremely plausible. I think it's somewhere middling. So I say any form of Christian theism, somewhere from 1% on a bad day to 5% on a good day. So that's the sort of range I would give, 1 to 5%. Bear in mind that that's any form of Christian theism. So this would be, you know, Jesus and God and things like that. But then if you start building in more particular theology to that, then the probabilities diminish. So like young earth creationism, effectively zero. Not exactly zero, but pretty close to it, right? So I you know, and then what about Catholicism? I mean, I don't know, less than 1%, right? But the point is, though, that even if you say 1%, that is way higher than most kind of EA space people. I mean, there are some Christians who are EAs, right? But a lot of people in EA would give nothing like that probability to theism or Christianity. And that's a criticism that I've made in the past, which is that, look, either we need one of two things. We need a good argument as to why we should place extremely low credences on theism and or no Christianity, or we should start talking more seriously about these sort of issues, right? Because actually, if we're interested in doing the most good and God exists, presumably that has implications about doing the most good. But we, as a movement, seem to just ignore that possibility. So it seems to me that we should have a good argument for doing that. And I think that there are good arguments for being an atheist, right? But what I don't think is there are good arguments for placing exceptionally small like epistemic probabilities on God's existence. But anyway, that's my view. I'd be interested to know what you think.
Well, so my view I think that the odds of God of Christian theism would be vanishingly small.
What about just generic theism?
So would generic theism just include a deity that is like not omnibenevolent, or?
Well, I guess when I say theism, I'm thinking an omni-creator, but not like incarnating in things. Well, not necessarily.
Oh yeah, so I would think that would also I would think that would be vanishingly small. The only thing.
Sorry, just to clarify that this is an epistemic, because as an atheist, right? I mean, I think that if you think that if you think that theism is false, you're presumably committed to the idea that it is metaphysically impossible for God to exist, right? Because it's supposed to be a necessary being, right? So in that sense, it's a zero probability, right? But there's just been an epistemic, and so I just wanted to clarify that. So we're talking,
Yeah, so I think that I would say that the epistemic probability would be vanishingly small. The only thing that would save it from being considerably smaller would be just the fact that there are lots of smart theists. But
yeah, but why still vanishingly?
Well, so I think that God is an extraordinarily poor explanation of nearly all things. And so, you know, on theism, the universe was made in some sense by God, and so, but it just seems like a huge portion of things in the universe just don't seem to be plausibly explained by God, and so. It seems like if you were an omniscient and omnipotent being and you were just designing a universe, there are lots of ways you could do it better, and ways that are even just very, very trivial. So God could make it presumably so that food just tasted better, right? And it seems like food tasting good is good, all else equal. So it seems like God would be likely to do that, or to just make the sort of average, like midpoint of sentient beings be happier, or to get rid of any particular disease, just have those not be created in the first place. And so it just seems like there are some things that naturalism has some trouble explaining, but on theism it seems like a huge portion of things that exist in the universe just there's no good explanation of, and would be very, very implausible on theism.
Yeah, I mean, I essentially agree with those. I guess the meta point, though, is that everything that you or I say about why it's unreasonable to believe in a God, then there are counters, right? And I take peer disagreement very seriously, and so I think that it's appropriate to mostly accord our all things considered epistemic credences to something like what the distribution of expert views is. Now, that's hard to establish for theism, but on the basis of the evidence that does exist, I think that 1 in 10 is a good guess. And I would say vanishingly small is inappropriate. I mean, I can see people arguing for different precise numbers, but vanishingly small seems to imply that there would just have to be effectively no thoughtful, rational, epistemically virtuous persons that are theists. And that seems wrong to me. So I guess you could, of course, just reject the type of conciliationism. I mean, the thing is, I don't think you have to be very strong conciliationist to even move away from a vanishingly small. Even if you're in conciliate a bit, I think you move away from vanishing.
Well, to be clear, so when I say vanishingly small, I'd say maybe 1/4 or 0.5%. So not like 0.00001% or anything.
Well, I wouldn't call that vanishing. I mean, yeah, okay. The latter is what I would call vanishing, like 1 in a billion or something, or I don't know. So what did you say? 1/4%. So that's, yeah, I mean, interestingly, that's still a lot higher than many people that I've talked to, like many atheists, I mean, who will accord exceptionally low numbers. And the thing is that, so this is what I think, you may not agree with this. I think that people like, what's his name? Moral Disagreement, who's working on that? Will MacAskill. So Will MacAskill has written about the problem of moral disagreement with respect to, like, particularly normative ethics, and taking that very seriously, the idea that there's, reasonable disagreement. And I agree that is an important thing to consider. But why not apply that to questions of, say, theism or religion generally? And even if you don't go full conciliationism and get to my 1 in 10, even if you're like 1% for any type of theism, surely that's enough to seriously consider as an EA or as an EA movement. Or maybe you disagree. Like it seems that there's an inconsistency, is what I'm saying here.
Maybe. I mean, maybe 1/4% would be a little bit too high.
Well, the point is not the exact number, right? But
yeah, I mean, that does start to seem a bit like Pascal's wager-esque. I'd be curious as to sort of if you think it's 1 in 10, like how would you resist Pascal's wager?
Well, I mean, Pascal's wager is an argument for particular actions, and I don't think that the argument is good, right? But in terms of taking, there's a difference between taking an idea seriously and actually embracing the idea, right? I think that, I mean, I don't want to call it Pascal's wager because I don't think it is, but the idea that the magnitude and plausibility of an idea combine to give you some sort of judgment about how seriously you should take it, that seems entirely plausible to me. And in fact, EA makes that argument all the time about, plausibility and scope and neglectedness in terms of its interventions, right? And other retorsive arguments. And as an argument for worrying about X risk in AI, they'll say that, look, even if it's a small probability that we're right about AI, then the possible outcome is so dramatic that we should take that seriously. That's not Pascal's wager. There's, I guess, an analogy there about but it really is just an expected value argument. And I think that if we're going to say every expected value argument is too suspicious because it looks like Pascal's wager, then we've gone too far. I don't think Pascal's wager is a good reason to act as if you are a Christian or to try to become a Christian. But I think expected value arguments are something like that type of argument is reasonable when we ask, look, how seriously or how much attention should we give an idea? And even if you give fairly low credences to some type of theism, the implications seem large enough such that it warrants consideration. As long as we're broadly in the scope of considering that type of argument, plus worrying about peer disagreement. But it seems as EAs we are in that framework. So that's where I worry there's an inconsistency there.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if EAs took that seriously, would you advocate that they?
Oh, hello. That's probably my internet. Oh, seems to be still online.
Wait, sorry. You
froze for a second there. I wasn't sure if it was you or me.
Yeah. Sorry, my Ethernet cable came unplugged.
So that's not good.
Yeah. Well, no, it just like pops out sometimes. But it's not. So if EAs took this advice, would they distribute like CDs of William Lane Craig to like all across the globe in order to turn lots of people into Christians?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm pretty sure you know that I wouldn't say that. And the argument wouldn't be that actually we do anything to promote Christianity. The argument would be that we should consider philosophy of religion and surrounding questions more seriously as part of questions that EAs talk about. It's not even clear what beyond that I would say, right? Because I'm not saying I have the answer there. But what I would say is that philosophy of religion and related questions are essentially completely ignored in EA, and it's not clear what the justification for that is, given the other commitments that EAs have, or typically have, let's say, like McCaskill worrying about peer disagreement in the case of normative ethics, and given the typical expected value type arguments that we make. Like, given those things, I'm not sure what the argument is for just completely ignoring all issues of philosophy of religion.
Yeah.
So what I think we should do is start talking about it and thinking about it seriously. Beyond that, I don't have very specific recommendations because I'm not sure. I don't know what the implications of that would be. Like, where we get to that is with the investigations or the discourse.
That's interesting. I mean, one move that I am tempted to make is just sort of like a Moorian shift. Like, I don't know, the arguments for like taking peer disagreement seriously seem for like deferring to the consensus of peers, like seem less compelling than the arguments against God.
So seem less compelling than the arguments against God? Than
the arguments for God, or the sort of sum total of considerations favoring or disfavoring God, which I think overwhelmingly disfavor God.
I mean, that seems to be then. Yeah, I don't know. I guess we could have a long discussion about peer disagreement then. I'm not sure why we would think that peer disagreement is an issue in some areas and not in others, unless you think that the theists just don't have the, let's say, epistemic virtues that, I don't know, deontologists have. If you think that it's worth taking deontology seriously, even though you think the arguments against it are convincing, but you don't think it's worth taking theism seriously, even though you don't find the arguments for it seriously, it seems that, well, maybe deontologists are just like epistemically much better than theists. I don't find that plausible. I don't think that theists are sort of epistemically actually significantly different from anyone else, apart from, obviously, I think that they're wrong about that particular point, but I don't see the argument for why we should just not apply the peer disagreement concerns to them and that position. That seems really ad hoc to me.
Sure. I mean, I think that I would perhaps be even less less convinced by moral disagreement than like most EAs, and certainly like McCaskill. I mean, on similar grounds, the arguments for utilitarianism just seem to be sufficiently compelling that, and these are sort of the two philosophical positions that I have really strong opinions about. So I'm not always this much of a dogmatist, but it seems like the arguments for utilitarianism are like, I mean, I don't know if my credence in utilitarianism, I don't think it would be higher than my credence in the external world, but it wouldn't be too, like, it just seems, the arguments for it just seem to be like incredibly decisive.
How then do you explain disagreement on the issue between people who are apparently, well motivated and well informed, if the arguments are so overwhelming?
Well, so one thing is that I think that, like, it's just very easy to sort of dismiss utilitarianism sort of overly hastily by rattling off like 5 counterintuitive implications of it and then not give it a second thought. I think that it sort of only becomes sort of obviously pretty overwhelmingly compelling if one sort of really thinks about it in great detail in a way that I think has not been done often enough. But I think that like, yeah, I mean, this does get into some problems, because it's not clear on what grounds I would trust my judgment over the judgments of other people. But I think that, like, you can have lots of smart people believing crazy things in a variety of
utilitarianism.
Yeah, right.
Obviously, that's a cheap shot, right? But that is true under any rule and any view, right? Like, everyone agrees with that, whether you're a conciliationist or not. Well, depending on exactly what you mean by crazy, but at least things that you think are wrong. But the point is that I guess the way I think about it is that you do need to adjust for external incentives and prior biases and things like that. But even when making those adjustments as plausibly we can, and a lot of these are sociological factors, so they're hard to judge, it's not clear to me that we can dismiss the judgments or insights or whatever of a great many thoughtful theists, just like we can't for those who hold other philosophical positions, right? So I tend to be pretty strongly conciliationist about most philosophical positions. I may defend a philosophical position more strongly than I hold to it because I think that there's value in doing that. I don't think there's any inconsistency there. So if you ask me what my sort of internal sense of it is, of the plausibility of theism is, I'd say very low. But my all things considered judgment is different. Like my own assessment of the arguments is not the same as my all things considered judgment of the plausibility of a position, because the all things considered factors in essentially, these facts about disagreement and other factors about my own biases and things that I don't think directly considered when you just look at the argument. So I take that very seriously. And I think that it's hard to give a consistent account of what to think about these apparently smart, apparently well-meaning people who disagree if the arguments are so overwhelming.
Yeah. Pure disagreement, it does pose problems for how we're sort of justified in thinking and holding on to our firmest convictions, or whether we are justified in. I'll have to think more about that.
Oh, that's fine. We don't have to. I should probably get going now. Maybe that's a good pessimistic note to leave it on. Any final, questions you want to ask quickly, or just concluding stuff?
No. Thanks for coming on. It was a good chat. And
it was really good. Thanks for having me. Hopefully people found this interesting.
Hey, talk to you
See ya.
at some future juncture. Bye.